Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Arindam Goswami, a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution. Today we are exploring the shadowy space between peace and war, the grey zone. It's where nations fight without fighting, coerce without conquering, and win without anyone noticing they've lost. From Chinese border villages in the Himalayas to Pakistan's proxy networks, from cyber operations to cartographic aggression, these are the invisible battles reshaping global security. Our guest today, Colonel Vikrant Shinde, a research fellow at Takshashila, has mapped this murky terrain with a groundbreaking framework that helps us understand how India faces simultaneous grey zone campaigns on two fronts. So let's decipher this invisible war. Colonel Vikrant Shinde, great to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Arindam, for the introductory comments on my paper titled Deciphering the Grey Zone, which has been published in the Takshashila Institution's website. I look forward to an interesting conversation here today.
Great. And what a timely paper that you've come out with, considering the recent happenings, not just in India's neighborhood, but also across the world, Israel, Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, and we have seen a proliferation of these grey zone tactics. So I'm sure it's going to be interesting to, look at the details of what constitutes grey zone. So let's start with some conceptual foundation, right? I would like to explore the space between war and peace. You challenge the common understanding of grey zone as just another form of warfare. So can you walk us through why you argue it's better understood as an operational space rather than a type of warfare itself? And what difference does this distinction make for policymakers?
If you look at war as a phenomena, simply put, it's an act of being in armed contestation, while warfare essentially is the methodology of getting into this indulgence. So unlike war, which has a beginning and an end, actions in the grey zone conform to a contest in perpetuity, if you can look at it that way. It is an operational space, therefore, for application of tools of contestation, which could be different forms of warfare. And that is why I feel a definition which identifies grey zone as an operational space for carrying out contestation between actors as a more apt description of grey zone rather than it being a form of warfare.
Right. And throughout your research, what definitional ambiguities or misconceptions about the grey zone did you encounter most frequently in Indian security discourse or maybe even, in other security discourses across the world?
So as I was analyzing the existing definitions from major think tanks and other scholars on the whole concept of grey zone, as such. Certain things where clarity existed across definitions was first being below the threshold of war. So that was clearly being brought out by most definitions. Second thing was regarding the long incubation periods. So these were campaigns which lasted over periods, over decades in that sense. And third was the participation of state as well as non-state actors in this contestation. And fourth, clarity that exists across definitions is on the aspect of escalation management. The areas where ambiguity existed in definitions was first regarding asymmetry. So certain Western definitions kind of focus on the fact that grey zone is something which is engaged by where there is a asymmetry, lack of asymmetry between two powers, and the lower power kind of engages in grey zone, which I feel evidence points against. There are enough major powers like regime change operations in, say, Libya and all, where there are major powers which were in a contestation against a lower power, and yet they kind of resorted to grey zone activities to achieve their objectives. So asymmetry is not essentially, there is a contestation between powers, but it's not necessary that a lower power is the only one indulging in grey zone operations. It could also be superior powers which would resort to it, basically to avoid a full-scale confrontation. essentially being a very cost ineffective kind of a option. That was one. Second was ambiguity on the employment of military instruments itself. So most definitions try to hint at keeping the military instrument out of grey zone contestations, which I feel is not completely applicable across all grey zone operations. So there are military instruments which might get used in a grey zone contestation, and yet the information domain around that particular use of military options would be so doctored that it fits in a grey zone contestation which avoids escalation and while retains attributability to some extent, and yet doesn't escalate to a full-scale war. So military instruments also have a role to play in grey zone contestations is my argument. And the third thing is about attributability. So most definitions are heavily in favor of non-attributability as a ingredient of grey zone contestations, while I feel it is more selective attributability rather than non-attributability which forms a part of grey zone. So there would be occasions when you would indulge in use of a military instrument without attributability or with attributability, depending on what your end goals in the information domain are. So the grey zone operational space caters for both kind of ends where so attributability in itself cannot be a defining factor in grey zone contestations.
Right, right. And before we go to the 4-quadrant framework that you have written about in your paper, I would like to just double click on some aspects here. You mentioned information and attributability and these aspects which come from the narrative domain also, right? So is narrative warfare an important part of grey zone now, especially if when it comes to say attributability or when it comes to escalation management?
Yeah, and as we go further in this talk, when we come to gradualism and all those determinants of grey zone, so information does act almost like a super substrate on which the whole grey zone operation space might ride. This is because a lot of impact or the effects of grey zone are felt in a perceptual domain. So an event in itself might be just a dot, but to connect the picture, it is the narrative which makes a whole picture. So you would have an event occurring which you feel is a grey zone kind of an event, but when you join the dots backwards in history and you foretell a trajectory of a likelihood of future events, that is where the picture emerges, and that is where the narrative kind of binds it together.
Right, right. So yeah, now let's move to that 4-quadrant framework, which I found very fascinating. This fascinating model where you have 4 quadrants: regular warfare, irregular warfare, competition, and deterrence. Right. So could you explain how this matrix helps us understand what's happening in real-time conflicts, and perhaps maybe using a recent example from India's borders, if possible? Yeah.
So coming to the 4-quadrant framework that I've used, I borrowed it from a work by Robert Burrell, and which that work essentially explains a full spectrum conflict kind of a matrix, but I have kind of adapted it to my explanation of a multi-domain environment wherein the two axes, the x-axis or the horizontal axis is along which war and peace are laid out, and the vertical axis, the y-axis, is along which we have indirect and direct actions which are laid out, and these result in 4 quadrants being formed. The first one being regular warfare, which uses direct overt military action and it also caters for the escalatory dynamics within the overt military action cycle. Then the second quadrant which emerges is the irregular warfare quadrant, which is without the overt use of military force, where plausible deniability or non-attributability is a facet that can be leveraged by the actor exercising this option, and such as the form of proxies or through ideological or material support to campaigns which nations can indulge in. Then the targets in this in the second quadrant, that is the irregular quadrant, are primarily population centric, where the greater reliance is on effects in the cognitive domain. So you create a flashpoint event, but a population which is not directly affected by that event carries the effects of that event in its mind. So that's how it plays out in the cognitive domain through disruptive actions which are smaller in scale, so which prevent an outright escalation yet have an effect which is beyond the actual event itself. And then there's a third quadrant, which is the competition quadrant, which has least intensity in terms of violence. So, which will primarily be driven in the economic and diplomatic domains, where it'll aim at securing common interests, where while attempting to carve out mutually agreeable mechanisms such as treaties, free trade agreements, confidence building measures, etc. So these will get built into activities which will happen in this quadrant. And while in the third quadrant, as the locus of competition, I mean, as it starts shifting towards the vertical axis, so that competition will start emerging into a contestation, and that is where conflicts of interest will start emerging, and that is when an actor will get pushed into, again going back, either first into the second quadrant, that is irregular warfare, to gain a position of advantage in that contestation, or finally, if it escalates, go into the regular warfare quadrant, that is the first quadrant. And final is the fourth quadrant, which is the deterrence quadrant. So this deterrence in itself is a practice where you're trying to it is a thing which is happening in the perception domain. So actor which is deterred is feeling it in his mind that he's deterred, and that you achieve through events such as your military exercises. You have you kind of have joint exercises with your allies or strategic partners. So you're giving a semblance of existing kind of a threat in being, kind of a thing, or a capability in existence, which can manifest if you don't get deterred. So you are creating not a facade, but the right word for it would be a creating image or a perception that if you don't behave the way I want, then I can do certain things to you, which causes deterrence, and that is why the power which is being deterred behaves in a particular manner. But deterrence in itself is never absolute. It can't. I mean, you can't say that I've achieved deterrence and it will last forever. You need to reinforce that deterrence at regular intervals, because the power which is or the side which is getting deterred would always try to unshackle itself from that deterrence bind. And for doing that unshackling, it would go for capability enhancements of its own, so that it feels capable enough not to get deterred. And since capability development are long drawn processes, so in the interim it will try to fit in or contest that deterrence in the irregular space by getting into acts which are below the threshold of war. So while being deterred, he is trying to counter that, squeeze the deterrence space, and try to point out, hey, I'm not deterred, I can get back at you. So that is the contestation. So that is how these four quadrants kind of allow the gray zone operational space to play out.
One interesting aspect of this four quadrant framework is the regular warfare quadrant, right? You would expect in a gray zone framework to not have something which is explicitly regular warfare, right? So how do you explain that as part of gray zone?
Yeah. So why the first quadrant of regular warfare is retained in this framework is because even within regular warfare, there are aspects of gray zone that get exploited by the actors engaging in regular warfare to manage escalations. So if you look at a typical India-Pakistan contestation, so you've been having this disputed boundary in the line of control sector, and so there are claims and counterclaims. So that has been an active boundary for so many decades. And yet it doesn't spill. It had not spilled over to the areas of the international boundary till Sindoor happened. So this is where you use the narrative when you are acting against a threat from, say, proxy threat. You use the narrative game to say that okay, you are only hitting terror targets. So that is the gray zone you are using. You're saying okay, you're not going after the establishment. You're going after. So that is a way of managing escalation. So that is how I say, even while executing perfectly military actions, you will still rely on strains of gray zone to manage escalation and
so basically
use
gray
that space.
Aspects of other aspects of gray zone are also being used
in a kind of a interplay at all times.
Right. So now digging deep more into the strategic context in which India stands, right? So India has, as you have said, a two-front dilemma, right? India faces gray zone challenges from both Pakistan and China simultaneously, yet their toolkits are quite different. So, how do Pakistan's proxy driven irregular warfare tactics differ from China's gradualist approach with infrastructure development and border villages, right? And what does this mean for India's response strategy?
So if you look at the toolkits of Pakistan and China, they are starkly distinct. Like Pakistan's toolkit is a revisionist kind of an approach where they acknowledge the asymmetry that, okay, we enjoy an advantage in conventional power and yet not accept it as a status quo. So they want to kind of question that dominance, and therefore they indulge in contestations in the deterrence bind that they find themselves in, and that is why they use these proxies and all the gray zone activities that they've been resorting to over the years. On the other hand, in case of China, it is convinced of its global power ambitions, and it prefers to keep India in a kind of a continental bind through gray zone actions along disputed boundaries. So it keeps the dispute alive with actions which kind of strengthen its argument of its claims over such disputed areas through all these border villages, infrastructure development and all that, and yet doesn't get into it's only episodic flashpoint events which happen. So you are kept in a continental bind in that sense. Whereas if you look at the South China Sea, their approach in that areas, there they use the ambiguities of international laws to kind of test the boundaries with much superior power to achieve objectives in the classic salami slicing kind of a thing where they're inching towards their objectives without crossing a threshold. So their approach in the South China Sea is much different from what they do with India. And similarly, what Pakistan does is much different from what China indulges in. So that is where the differences lie.
Right. And one thing that you just mentioned about escalation, right? So that becomes very important nowadays when there's a myriad set of toolkits that can be used in gray zone, right? And how do you manage that escalation? How do you ensure that the tools that you're using in this gray zone warfare do not lead to an escalation which you can't manage, right? So you have traced a fascinating evolution from the 2001 Parliament attack to Operation Sindoor in 2025. And you have shown how these red lines keep shifting, right? So can you explain how each major incident changed the normative narrative and expanded what's acceptable in the gray zone? And taking this forward and extrapolating into the future, where do you see the next threshold?
Okay, so if you look at the Indo-Pak context, there has been a doctrinal evolution over the years. So if you look at, say, parliamentary attack and our response in the form of Parakram, so that kind of a response dynamics had emerged from our brass tacks exercises where we thought, it had thrown up an option of all or nothing kind of a response option. And so from that particular mobilization, we learned certain lessons and then evolved into a proactive doctrine, which is also colloquially sometimes referred to as the cold start doctrine, which essentially relied on a hit, mobilize and hit harder kind of a approach. But this was still a very escalatory approach. So over the years, it was probably realized that outright escalations might not be a go-to option all the time. So post, say, Uri and Balakot, what emerged was a dynamic response strategy which started coming into play, where there was greater escalation management that could be achieved by using methods which were giving out the right message or signaling and yet keeping the control over the way escalation took place. And to this, the way Pakistan has evolved its strategy, it's gone in for a QPQ or a quid pro quo plus kind of a response option where it assures that, okay, if India were to do a particular thing to punish its activities in a gray zone operational space, then it would always retaliate with a response which would be a notch higher, a notch above kind of a response to Indian actions. And that you would have seen play out even in during the Balakot strikes, where the swift retort was launched by Pakistan immediately the next day. And even in Op Sindoor, you saw them before. So Now, in a dynamic response strategy, the way India has evolved, it's to the new normal now. So, where you have an assurance of punishment being inflicted and doing so from a position of advantage when the escalation is kind of ended. So that is what in Op Sindoor you tried to achieve, and your stated objectives were to target terror infrastructure. While having done that, because Pakistan chose to retaliate, then you did escalate further and went after military targets, inflicted substantial damage, and thereafter the Pakistan kind of urged US to intervene and then sought a ceasefire. So when you actually accepted a ceasefire request from Pakistan, you did it from a position of advantage. So that is how the escalation management is evolving in this space.
Right. So further in your paper, you have created a funnel test, sort of, right, which tests for gray zone activities. Now, this funnel test of yours uses four determinants: gradualism, escalation management, selective attributability, and tactical clarity with strategic ambiguity. So, could you firstly explain these four determinants and how the funnel test works? And then apply this test to one of any one case study, like maybe the Balakot one, Galwan one, or even maybe Operation Sindoor. Yeah.
So I kind of evolved this funnel test based on the evidence which could be put together using this four quadrant matrix, and then what emerged as these determinants are basically attributes which gray zone activities have. And so these four are, as you stated, gradualism. So gradualism is basically, it has a strand which is continuing. So in case of, say, India and Pakistan, so Pakistan has been pushing this narrative of they have been resorting to proxy war, but the narrative that they try to put out is that it's an indigenous movement. That is, it is Kashmiri is aspiring for this kind of a thing. So they've kept that as a gradualistic strand throughout years. So whenever even they indulge in, say, 65 or even 47, 48, when they initially began their actions to annex J&K at the very outset, so they try to show it as a tribal invasion, try to show it as an indigenous kind of reaction to India's presence there. So that is the gradualistic strand they have maintained. Second aspect to it is the escalation management, which remains central to all gray zone activities, because the very fact that you are resorting to gray zone is you don't want to get into the conventional or a full ops domain. So while you want to push boundaries, but you don't want it to boil over. So that is where the escalation management part comes in. So this strand particularly you could see in our response to, say, Pulwama, or even when we did Balakot strikes, or even when we did the post-Uri surgical strikes, or even when we did the phase 1 of Operation Sindoor. So the central part of our info narrative was that we are going after terror targets. We made it explicit that it was terror targets that we were going at, and only in phase 2, when we started hitting the military targets, so the new normal emerged, where now we say that we are not going to distinguish between the perpetrators of terror and their state sponsors. So that is where this the whole thing about escalation management comes in. Then there is the third attribute of selective attributability. So you choose the person who is using a gray zone action makes a conscious choice whether he wants to seek attributability in that particular action or pass it on to proxies to remain detached from it. So Pakistan classically has been always denying any state involvement and has pushed it onto the proxy. So moment the incident happens, it's a proxy which claims responsibility of that particular event, and it tries to manage escalations, because now going after that proxy becomes a kind of an inconclusive engagement. And last is tactical clarity versus strategic ambiguity. So if you pick up any of these events, so you will see at the execution level of that event, say if you look at Pahalgam, when the terror act happened, there was tactical clarity on what the perpetrators wanted to do. They selectively chose males from a particular religious denomination. So that came out starkly. They could have, had it been a random act without any tactical clarity, they could have kill women also. But then they realized that it would have a negative spiral on the narrative. So they kept that. So that is where the tactical clarity bit comes in. And strategic ambiguity is where you do an act, but you're not, the person who's affected by the act is not really able to put a finger on the pulse as to why is this particular act being perpetrated at this point in time. What is the, so that is where you feel when the response is being thought of, there's a dilemma that gets created, is how hard or how escalatory the response has to now go.
Right. So this funnel of yours, these four determinants are always characteristics of any gray zone activity, or they can have any one of these aspects.
No, mostly, I mean, that I have tested this funnel for activities between India, Pakistan, and India, China, from a period, say, from Uri or Galwan, and that till now. And these four determinants do qualify to fit into all the thing. But now, if you look at, these have to be then looked at all the other aspects of national power that get employed, whether you'll have certain aspects being played out in the diplomatic domain, certain in the informational domain, like you would have a gradualism narrative being carried by the diplomatic part of it. Whereas in the military domain, it would be a episodic event which would do something else. So, but then escalation control would be managed by the informational domain. And, the economic punishment in this case would play out on a longest drawn period. So those kind of things, that is how it pans out.
Right. Of all of these, the attributability paradox is also something which is very interesting. You have made a counter-intuitive argument that non-attributability isn't always necessary in gray zone operations. You briefly alluded to it in the opening remarks also. But could you again maybe elaborate on why did you challenge conventional wisdom on this point, and what strategic communication purposes does selective attribution actually serve?
So attributability, I feel, has a perceptional domain objective to it. So like Pak proxies being highlighted, like I just said. So the gradualistic narrative where Pakistan attributes it to the proxies but doesn't claim, whereas their political rhetoric within the country is always talks of supporting the Kashmir freedom movement and all that. So they retain a detached kind of association with this, while the perpetrators seek attribution. So they say, okay, we did it. Say a Lashkar-e-Toiba or a Hizbul Mujahideen group would claim attributability to an event, which the state of Pakistan would say, okay, we have got nothing to do with this, but we overall support the struggle that they are in. So that is the kind of, so it is selective. Similarly is in case of India's responses. So we hit back, but we say that, okay, we are doing it against terror targets. That is now shifting because that is not having commensurate, you're not getting to your objectives. So now you say, okay, we are not going to be distinguishing between the state or the perpetrators when we hit back. While similarly in some other places where we've done kinetic actions, or say on the eastern borders against certain militant organizations and all that, but we've not outrightly claimed it. Even in the case of, say, Uri surgical strikes, so there used to be similar tactical response options exercised earlier than that, but we went upfront and said that, okay, now, so that selective attributability came in. So this time you wanted to state it that yes, we are inflicting punishment for your transgressions.
Right. Now let's shift some attention towards the cross-domain dynamics of in your paper. Right, you have talked about information warfare as the central domain. Throughout your paper, the informational domain appears as the strategic substrate that runs through all quadrants. How do actors like Pakistan and China weaponize information differently? And is India seemingly playing catch-up in this domain, or are we also, equally good at doing this?
There is an inherent, I would not say a disadvantage, but a limitation that democratic nations would always have compared to autocratic or say a country like Pakistan or China, which would, because there the control of the narrative is central and it is uncontested. Whereas in the case of a democracy, it's always, there's a free press and there are opinions which people are free to voice, and so state has a narrative, it says what it is doing, yet the consumers of their narrative are free to question it. So there's a limitation that imposes on how a narrative pans out. So a gray zone threat, it involves the coordinated and cogent application of all instruments of power at the disposal of a state. So colloquially, these could be like domains. There are geographical or physical domains, which are like air, land, and the maritime domain. And then there are the cognitive domains, which is the electromagnetic spectrum, the cyberspace. So the manifestation of gray zone in each of these will have different impact. So in the physical domains, it's more pronounced, it's more visible, it's difficult to not respond to. Whereas in the cognitive domain, it could be, responded to without seeking attributability. Say in a cyber attack kind of a situation, you might respond in ways that suit you best, and yet not play out in the narrative domain as much. So it'll be more subtle yet effective. So that's the difference between any gray zone contestation will play out different domains, both the physical and the cognitive ones, at different times in different intensities with whatever the objectives they are inching towards. And sometimes a particular domain will take a front seat. Say in case of Operation Sindoor, the air domain got explicitly played out, while in the earlier say Uri response, we restrained it to a military domain kind of a thing. Whereas when we were getting after Pakistan in the period when it went under listing, FATF grey listing and all that, so the informational domain was to hold it accountable for the global terror that it was perpetuating. So it depends on which domain you want to kind of bring to the forefront in what response dynamics.
Right. And I guess it becomes information warfare becomes important since now there's like a dual superposition of both success and failure states, right? I mean, based on the narrative, you can craft your own success and failure, results, and then there it becomes very important how you deploy the narrative domain. Yeah. Now, coming to the deterrence part in the gray zone, right? You have presented a complex map of deterrence dynamics. There's denial versus punishment, cross-domain deterrence. You have also shown how India deters China differently than Pakistan. So, given this asymmetry, is India's current deterrence posture sustainable, or does it need some fundamental recalibration?
So if we look at deterrence as a concept itself, so it is a practice of discouraging or restraining someone from taking an unwanted kind of action against you. So this can be it can play out in two ways. One is deterrence by denial. So you basically are convincing the other guy that if you do something, you have the capability to deny him from reaching his objectives. So that deters him to get into a escalatory thing where he feels it will be non-cost productive to get into a thing without achieving its objectives. So that is deterrence by denial. And deterrence by punishment is where you demonstrate capability, where you say, okay, if you do action, there is assured punishment that will be inflicted upon you, and that deters because that to go through that punishment is not again cost effective for the perpetrator, so he kind of gets deterred and avoids getting into this thing. And it is from this deterrence bind to kind of unshackle oneself from this deterrence bind that people engage in the grey zone operational space. Now in the India say Pakistan context, so given the near parity kind of power dynamics in terms of military strengths, so mostly deterrence by denial is what Pakistan kind of works on. And that is where it's, the nuclear saber rattling and all that it gets into is coming from. Whereas in the India-China context, it's while India kind of tries to play out a deterrence by denial kind of posture, while China kind of plays out a deterrence by punishment kind of a posture against India. So that is how deterrence remains active in that contestation.
Right. Now let's look at some policy implications of this, right? There's a time dimension problem also, right? You have emphasized that gray zone campaigns unfold across over decades with no clear victories or defeats sometimes. So how should democratic governments with their electoral cycles every 5 years and public accountability problems, how should such democratic governments design long-term gray zone strategies when the payoffs may not materialize for years, right? So how do democratic governments look at this?
I think the approach to this is in the the structural arrangements that governments have. So irrespective of which elected government, there are structures that a nation finds for itself. It would have, like in our case, there's a federal structure. So you have certain things which are state subject, certain things which are. So one solution lies in that part where you address the structures which allow slipping past, gray zone activities to slip past till they become really serious in their manifestations. So that is something. So your intelligence structures need to refine themselves so that there is cross-state cooperation on sharing of intelligence on activities which show the strand of a gray zone trajectory where to begin with they might be very mundane, even having more of a criminal kind of a dynamics, but then they have the potential to evolve into a major security kind of a threat. So those structures need to be strengthened and wired in a manner that any slippages between the gaps is avoided. Now, for instance, if you look at Naxalism as a threat, a security threat, while it began as a West Bengal centric. Then it spread pan India. Then at a point, a prime minister had to come on, call it out as a national security priority. And then the response started where you started, collaborating between states. You started having better response, coherence in the response mechanics. So, and all this played out over a few decades, which can be plugged and which can be, nipped in the bud if you strengthen your structures in a manner that they can respond to emerging threats by being able to trace out a trajectory where it can take you and then decide, okay, this is a priority threat which might emerge, say, a decade down the line into a major issue, and you need to allocate resources to it and get after it right now.
Right. So there are these institutional blind spots where these structures will help identify some aspects that could blow into full blown maybe conflicts.
So that is where the funnel test could help the policymakers, because when you map it out, when activity events are happening in isolation years apart, you don't see where it is going. You take it as individual events. But when you try to map it out and trace the lines, then you know where it began, why it is sustaining, and where it is headed. So that is where the the policy angle will get assisted by this kind of a framework.
And just extrapolating to the world stage, right? Do you think these structures have failed across the world in conflicts, because the number of tools that are available at the disposal of gray zone warfare have increased, yet you see a lot of these wars happening. There's the Israel-Gaza conflict, there's the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and so on, and we had the India-Pakistan war also. So are these structures within the security architectures failing or not really working to the extent that we want them to across the world?
More than a failure, I would say the security structure has a dual challenge. It is always faced with ongoing threats and emerging threats. So that is where, because of resource constraints, you'll always try to prioritize the ongoing ones, and you keep your focus on the ongoing ones while a emerging one gets lost sight of or takes a back seat. And that's the advantage the gray zone tries to exploit. So you tend to, the perpetrator of gray zone the person exploiting the gray zone operational space would try to keep the threshold of his activities such that in the perceptional domain, they still fall in the emerging threat category, and yet they are inching towards an objective. And when that emerging threat kind of trajectory comes and, coincides with the current threat of the establishment or the structures, that is when the response then starts kicking in.
So in a sense, gray zone warfare, because of its very diffuse nature, would probably always be one step ahead of what formal security structures can anticipate. Is that a fair statement to make?
No, I would contest that with rather, to put it would not be kind of ahead of, but it would be kind of in the blind spot sometimes. So the security structure would be aware of it, but because it's not critical enough, it would not be responding in its right earnest because you can, allocate resources and get after only X number. Threats are multiple. Some threats they are evolve and then they petter out. So that dilemma will always be there to what to prioritize your resources against. And that is the blind spot which the gray zone will continue to try to exploit. So sometimes it will succeed, and those are the times which will become flashpoint events, which will draw commensurate responses as they evolve.
Right. And I think this is a good point to now come to our last question, right? When we are looking at the futuristic aspects of this. So, given the evolution of AI, information warfare, and like multi-domain coercion, how do you see gray zone contestations changing over the next decade? And what must Indian policymakers especially reimagine in their security calculus to stay ahead?
So as I see the way, the whole information substrate is occupying a center space as the whole conflict dynamics is evolving around the world. So for a nation or a state to be able to respond in a coherent manner, certain imperatives which immediately come up are cross-domain coordination, through interministerial coordination architectures, inter-organizational interfacings, which should be able to plug the gaps or the minimize the blind spots that gray zone can exploit. And coordinated response is the only way forward to both coordinated response in across the domains. You cannot have solitary responses giving you, dividends in a threat which is playing out in a multi-domain environment.
And considering that AI has both dual aspects, there's military aspect and there's a much more proliferating civilian use of AI, right? So would it also then mandate a much more integrated coordination with the private sector to, be able to understand these aspects?
Yeah, in fact, most technologies have had that trajectory. Any exclusive military technology won't have the market advantage at all. So all technologies will evolve to tap the market advantage, and militaries will adapt it to suit its requirement. So I think there's no denying the fact that AI is a emerging domain which militaries can't do without. So militaries will have to tap into this resource pool or this tech emerging technology. And while catering for its information security requirements and confidentiality and all those issues, but AI is indispensable. You can't, any military or security strategy without riding on it will be a disadvantaged one.
Right. Great, Vikrant. Thanks for this fascinating discussion. I think our listeners would have enjoyed this. I would urge our listeners to also read the paper that Vikrant has come out with. We'll link it in the show notes. Hope you all have enjoyed, and thanks, Vikrant, for joining us today.
Thank you, Arindam. As always, it's been a pleasure to have this discussion and to have this opportunity to put out nuances about the paper, which is a more detailed take on the whole issue of grey zone. And I request the listeners to kind of have a look at the paper as well.
Thanks, Vikrant.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.